I always thought I had made the right decision moving into this neighborhood. The houses were beautiful, the streets were clean, and on the surface everything seemed peaceful. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that peace is often an illusion. And in this case, the illusion had a name: the HOA. Now, I had heard the horror stories before. Neighbors getting fined for leaving their trash cans out an hour too long, people being forced to repaint their houses because the color was one shade off from what the board approved. Ridiculous, power-hungry nonsense. But I never thought it would affect me. I had bought my house outright, no HOA contract attached, no rules I had to follow. I was free. Or so I thought. At first it was just small things, a letter here, a note there. Little reminders from the HOA, suggesting that I adjust my landscaping to better match the community aesthetic. I ignored them. My property was my business. Then came the official notices, claims that my trees were not in compliance with neighborhood standards. Apparently nature itself was violating the HOA's vision of uniform perfection. I laughed and tossed the letters in the trash. That was my first mistake. Because the thing about people like Karen, the HOA president, is that they don't like being ignored. They see it as a challenge. And Karen, she was the type who thrived on control. She didn't just want authority over the neighborhood. She wanted absolute obedience. She wanted to make an example out of me. And so, she did the unthinkable. I came home after a long day at work, expecting to unwind, maybe sit outside and enjoy the shade of the towering oak trees that had been standing for decades, long before the HOA ever existed. But the second I pulled into my driveway, something felt off. The air smelled different, like fresh-cut wood, like destruction. My stomach dropped. I stepped out of my car and froze. My trees, all of them, were gone. Not pruned, not trimmed. Gone. Thick stumps, brutally sawed off at the base, were all that remained. Wood chips littered my once pristine lawn, and the rich green canopy that had provided privacy and shade had been ripped away, leaving nothing but open sky and a barren, exposed yard. My home, my sanctuary, looked unrecognizable. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was in the wrong place, that I had driven to someone else's house by mistake, because there was no way this could have happened. No way someone had the audacity, the sheer nerve to do something like this. But then I saw the truck. Parked on the curb like a proud monument to their crime, an HOA-branded pickup sat in front of my house, chainsaws and tools still in the back, as if the people responsible hadn't even bothered to leave the scene yet. And standing next to it, arms folded across her chest, was Karen. She was smiling. That smug, self-satisfied expression that people wear when they think they've won. She wasn't just pleased with herself. She was proud. I felt something dark and unfamiliar rise in my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was something colder, sharper. I walked toward her, forcing myself to stay calm. Because people like Karen expect a reaction. They want it. They want to see you lose control, to see you lash out, because it makes them the victim. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Before I could even speak, she tilted her head and sighed dramatically. "Oh, good. You're home." I stared at her, waiting. "We had to take action," she continued, as if this was just another routine HOA decision. "Your trees didn't meet community standards. They were ruining the neighborhood aesthetic. But don't worry, now your yard looks so much more open and inviting." She actually thought she was doing me a favor. I glanced around at the destruction, at the lifeless stumps, at the gaping hole where my privacy once stood. I inhaled slowly, holding back the fury boiling beneath the surface. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice calm. "You came onto my property, without my permission, and cut down my trees." Karen didn't even blink. The HOA has the right to make landscaping decisions when it affects property values. It's all in the best interest of the community. I nodded slightly, as if considering her words. Good, I said. Then you won't mind if I take this to court. For the first time, her expression faltered. She let out a stiff laugh. Oh, there's no need for that. It was just a small decision by the HOA. It's not a big deal. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. I'm a federal judge. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. What? I smiled. And what you just did? That wasn't just a small decision. That was trespassing. That was property destruction. That was a crime. Karen took a half step back, as if reality had just slapped her across the face. The confidence, the smugness, it vanished in an instant. I didn't wait for her to recover. I turned and walked toward my house, because I already knew exactly what was going to happen next. Karen thought she was untouchable, that she could get away with this because she was the HOA president, that she could control everyone in this neighborhood, including me. She had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because now she was my problem. Karen's reaction was exactly what I expected. Shock, fear, and then that desperate attempt to claw back some control. She opened her mouth, probably to spew some excuse, but for the first time, she had nothing. No rulebook to hide behind. No HOA fine print to twist in her favor. She had stepped out of the realm of petty HOA politics and into something much bigger. She had broken the law. I walked into my house, closing the door behind me, but I wasn't pacing in anger. I wasn't ranting or shouting. No, I was planning. Because people like Karen, they rely on intimidation. They rely on people backing down, giving up, accepting whatever ridiculous nonsense they throw their way. She thought I was just another homeowner she could bully. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The first thing I did was pull up the security footage. My house had multiple cameras: front yard, backyard, driveway. I scrolled through the recordings, watching as HOA workers marched onto my property with chainsaws and trucks. They didn't even hesitate. There was no careful pruning or necessary maintenance. It was destruction. A coordinated attack on my property. Karen was there the entire time, standing back with her arms crossed, nodding in approval as the first tree fell. I rewound, played it again. The arrogance, the audacity, the sheer entitlement. It made my blood boil. I downloaded the footage, saved multiple copies, and then started digging. Because if Karen was bold enough to do this to me, I had a strong suspicion this wasn't her first power trip. I started with the HOA's financials. See, most homeowners don't bother looking into where their fees go. They just pay them and assume the money is used for neighborhood maintenance, landscaping, security, whatever the HOA claims to be funding. But I knew better. And sure enough, after a little digging, I found exactly what I was looking for. The HOA's financial records were a mess. There were payments to landscaping companies that didn't exist. Thousands of dollars spent on administrative fees that led to personal accounts. Suspicious transactions that had nothing to do with neighborhood upkeep. Karen wasn't just on a power trip. She was running a full-blown scam. I wasn't just going to sue her for trespassing and destruction of property. I was going to dismantle everything she had built. But I wasn't going to strike immediately. No. Karen had spent years manipulating this neighborhood, convincing people that she was untouchable. I needed to make sure she never saw it coming. The next day, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. I didn't storm into the HOA office. I didn't confront her in front of the neighborhood. I didn't even acknowledge the destruction in my yard. Karen, of course, was waiting for a reaction. She wanted me to rage, to scream, to give her a reason to paint me as the problem. but I just smiled at her when I saw her in the street. It unnerved her. I could tell. The way her eyes flickered with uncertainty, the slight shift in her posture. She had won this battle, but she was starting to realize this wasn't over. The HOA must have sensed something was coming, because 3 days later, I received a letter in the mail. A warning. They claimed the trees were removed for safety concerns, and that the decision was final. Even worse, they had the audacity to state that if I attempted to plant new trees, I would need HOA approval, or I would be fined. I actually laughed when I read it. They still thought they were in control. I added the letter to my growing pile of evidence. Every word of it would be used against them. But before I took legal action, I wanted to make sure everyone in the neighborhood saw what I saw. I started talking to my neighbors, the ones who had grumbled about HOA fees but never questioned them, the ones who had quietly suffered fines and penalties but never fought back. I showed them what I found. The financial fraud, the missing money, the blatant misuse of power. The reactions were immediate. One neighbor, a retired veteran, clenched his fists as he scanned the records. So that's why they keep raising our fees. I knew something was off. Another woman, who had been fined repeatedly for parking in her own driveway, shook her head in disbelief. She told me we were short on funds, but she's been stealing from us? It spread like wildfire. People started talking, comparing notes, realizing just how deep the corruption went. And then, the first official complaint was filed. Not by me, by the residents. Karen had spent years convincing this neighborhood that she was the ultimate authority, that she controlled everything, that no one could stand against her. But the moment the community turned on her, her empire began to crumble. By the end of the week, the city had launched an investigation into the HOA's finances. The Environmental Board had been notified about the illegal tree removal. The homeowners had called an emergency meeting, demanding answers. Karen had lost control, but I wasn't done yet. Because while she was scrambling to explain the missing money, while she was panicking over the growing outrage, I was preparing the final blow. I filed my lawsuit. For trespassing, for destruction of private property, for damages. And with the overwhelming evidence I had gathered, I knew exactly how this would end. Karen had spent years using fear to rule over this community. Now, she was the one who was afraid. The moment Karen realized she was losing control was almost too perfect. She had spent years dictating every little detail of this neighborhood, how people could paint their houses, where they could park, even what kind of plants they could put in their gardens. She had fined people for ridiculous things, bullied homeowners into submission, and convinced herself that she was untouchable. But now she was scrambling. The first sign of her panic came in the form of yet another letter from the HOA. This one was different from the usual passive-aggressive nonsense. Instead of a warning or a fine, it was an invitation, an emergency HOA meeting. Karen never asked residents to attend meetings. She ordered them. She sent out mandates, not requests. But this letter, it practically begged people to show up. The reason? To address concerns regarding recent community decisions and ensure harmony moving forward. Translation. Karen was in damage control mode. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted to get ahead of the outrage, to spin the story before things spiraled completely out of her control. She probably thought if she could just explain herself, if she could convince people that everything was a misunderstanding, she could put out the fire. What she didn't know was that the fire had already spread. Word had gotten around. My neighbors weren't just annoyed anymore, they were furious. Some of them had already started digging into their own HOA records, and the more they found, the angrier they got. People who had never questioned Karen's authority were now openly talking about lawsuits, recalls, and dissolving the HOA entirely. By the time the meeting rolled around, the community center was packed. Karen sat at the front of the room, her usual air of superiority looking noticeably shaky. She had tried to put on her best leader face, but I could see it, the twitch of her fingers, the way she kept adjusting her papers, the stiffness in her posture. She knew this wasn't going to be a normal meeting. She started with the usual corporate nonsense. We understand that there have been concerns regarding recent actions taken by the HOA, and we want to reassure all residents that every decision was made with the best interests of the community in mind. Lies. We acknowledge that there may have been some miscommunication, and we are more than happy to clarify any concerns. More lies. She was stalling, trying to set the tone before anyone could speak. She thought if she could talk first, if she could get her version of the story out there, she could control the conversation. She was wrong, because the second she finished, hands shot up across the room. A man in the front row, one of the residents who had been fined for parking in his own driveway, stood up first. "I want to know where our money is." Karen blinked. I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," he shot back. "Our HOA fees have gone up every year, but our roads still have potholes. Our parks are falling apart. And somehow, there's never money in the budget for actual improvements. But you had no problem spending thousands of dollars on landscaping that no one approved." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another woman stood up. "I checked the financial statements. You approved payments to a landscaping company that doesn't exist. Where did that money actually go?" Karen's face paled. "That's a misunderstanding, I can assure you." But the residents weren't letting her off the hook. More voices joined in. "What about the trees you destroyed? You think you can just walk onto people's property and do whatever you want? You told me I had to pay a $500 fine for planting the wrong kind of flowers, but you can just steal from the HOA with no consequences. This isn't mismanagement, this is fraud." Karen tried. She really tried to regain control. She kept insisting that she had authority, that everything was within HOA guidelines, that people were misinterpreting the situation. But the more she talked, the angrier the crowd got. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for her, I stood up. Silence. Karen's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw it. Fear. I took my time. I let the weight of the moment settle before I spoke. "You want to talk about misinterpretations," I said, placing a thick folder on the table at the front of the room. "Let's talk about facts." Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I tapped the folder. Inside this are records of unauthorized transactions, fraudulent payments, and HOA fees being misused for personal expenses. I let that sink in before adding, "all signed off by you." Gasps, murmurs. Karen actually reached for the folder, but I slid it away. "Oh no, don't worry. I've already sent copies to the city. They'll be handling the financial crimes investigation." She visibly swallowed. "And just in case you think that's the worst of it," I continued, "I also have documentation proving that my property was never under the HOA's jurisdiction, meaning the trees you destroyed. That wasn't just an overstep of authority. That was criminal trespassing and destruction of private property." Karen's face turned a shade of white I'd never seen before. Someone in the back of the room laughed. People started whispering to each other, some openly grinning, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen had spent years ruling over this neighborhood, treating homeowners like her personal subjects. Now she was watching her empire collapse. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse for her, her phone rang. She flinched at the sound. Every single person in the room watched as she hesitated, then slowly picked it up. I already knew who it was. The city, the authorities, the people who had just received the very same evidence I had presented. Her face crumbled as she listened. Her fingers tightened around the phone, Her lips parted slightly in horror. When she finally hung up, she didn't even look at the crowd. She just stood up, grabbed her things, and walked out. No grand speech, no desperate attempt to justify herself. She knew it was over, and as she disappeared out the door, I couldn't help but think, this wasn't just about me. This wasn't just about my trees. This was about every single person she had screwed over, every fine, every unjust rule, every stolen dollar. She thought she could get away with it forever. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. The days following Karen's downfall were some of the most satisfying I had ever experienced. For years she had ruled over this neighborhood like a tyrant, using fear, intimidation, and bureaucracy to keep everyone in line. She had convinced herself that she was invincible, that no one would ever dare to challenge her authority. But now her name had become a joke. Neighbors who once grumbled in private were speaking out openly. People who had spent years bending to her ridiculous rules were now refusing to acknowledge them. And the best part, the HOA had completely fallen apart. Karen had tried to maintain control even as the walls closed in, but once the city got involved, there was nothing she could do. The financial fraud investigation moved fast, faster than even I expected. It turned out my findings were just the tip of the iceberg. Karen hadn't just been mismanaging funds, she had been stealing. Thousands of dollars in fake invoices, personal purchases disguised as community improvements, HOA dues funneled directly into private accounts. She had used her position to enrich herself for years, assuming no one would ever check the books. Now the authorities were checking everything. Her bank accounts were frozen. Subpoenas were issued. Every single financial record was being audited. And as for the HOA itself, it was done. The board members, once loyal to Karen, started resigning one by one, each hoping to save their own skin. With every new piece of damning evidence, more of them bailed. Some even tried to claim they had no idea what Karen had been doing, as if that would somehow absolve them of responsibility. It didn't, because the homeowners weren't buying it. A movement started almost overnight, an effort to dissolve the HOA entirely. The petition spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and within days it had enough signatures to force a vote. And when that vote happened, it wasn't even close. The HOA was abolished. For the first time in decades, the neighborhood was free. No more ridiculous fines. No more arbitrary rules. No more Karen. And speaking of Karen, she was gone. One day, she was still trying to defend herself, still sending out weak, desperate emails to the community, still clinging to whatever power she thought she had left. The next, her house was up for sale. Rumors spread fast. Some said she was moving across the country to escape the shame. Others claimed she was trying to cut a deal with the city to reduce her punishment. I didn't care. She could run. She could hide. But she couldn't undo what had happened. She had spent years making people's lives miserable. Now, she had nothing. And as for me, I stayed exactly where I was. Because I had never planned to leave. I had never needed to run. My trees were gone, yes. My property had been violated. But in their place, something better had grown. Justice. A few months later, as I stood in my yard, looking at the fresh saplings I had planted to replace the ones Karen had destroyed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. True peace. Not the fake, forced kind that Karen had tried to impose, but the kind that comes from knowing that the right people won, that justice was served, and that a bully got exactly what she deserved. And as I watered my new trees, I smiled, because this time, no one could ever take them from me again.